Good afternoon. I hope you've enjoyed all of today's sessions so far. My name is Cheryl Alvarado, and this session is Zero Trust by John Garafola from Emporia State University. John will be taking questions at the end of his presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, click the link in the YouTube chat box. I'll turn it over to John now.
Thank you for the introduction, Cheryl. As she said, my name is John Garafola, and I'm an information security analyst at Emporia State University. Today, we'll be going over understanding Zero Trust, getting into the architecture of it and how it's relevant today. When I was initially asked to prepare a presentation for CHEC, I thought, wow, this is kind of a good idea. It's kind of a buzzword, you hear it floating around the office. And so I thought it'd be interesting to look into. And as we've kind of moved into this work from home environment, it's become more and more important. And I kind of see it as the future that we're going to be able to operate within. A little bit about myself. As I said, I've been with Emporia State University since about April of 2019. Before I joined a higher ed community, specifically at ESU, I spent 10 years as an air traffic controller for the Department of Defense, and I had a side duty as an information assurance support officer, and that's kind of just a fancy way of saying information security analyst that the DoD likes to use. And so anyways, yeah, that was a picture of me taken pre-COVID. We'll get into this a little bit further. Sam, am I still getting feedback here? All right, got the all clear, so we're going to keep pressing on here. Just a quick preface about this presentation. It was really kind of my goal to make this as accessible as possible to as many people in the IT profession as possible. If I mention a term or come across something that's unfamiliar, please let me know, and I'll be happy to come back to that with some additional clarity and context at the end of the presentation. And there should be a link to submit those questions if you have any, right in the YouTube chat box. I will be referencing some Microsoft products during the presentation, not as an endorsement, just as an effort to make things a little bit more relatable and accessible. I do have some alternatives to some of the Microsoft products that I can mention at the end if there's curiosity about that. So what am I going to cover here? I'm going to talk about the old network security paradigm, something that we've been operating in up until the mid-2000s. Kind of go over what is Zero Trust, some considerations for moving to the Zero Trust model. How do you enable a Zero Trust model for your user base? And then simile, for instance, kind of a real-world application of some of the principles of Zero Trust that hopefully kind of draw a corollary for you. So we'll start off with kind of a brief history of network security up until the Zero Trust model. You can kind of think of it like a medieval castle, if you will. Basically, we use the analogy of the castle wall and moat design. And the idea was that we have this robust perimeter. It's known as the firewall. And all of our trusted computers are behind the firewall. And anything that's behind the firewall has inherited trust. It can access corporate documents. It can connect to other computers. You can do whatever you wanted to, really, with some restrictions behind that firewall. And I've got a GIF here just to kind of represent that. We kind of thought about network security as, well, as long as you can't get into the castle, you're good. And it's very similar to how firewalls and network architecture used to be. We've since pivoted away from that since the development of hybrid architecture, having some data on premise, having some data managed in the cloud. So Zero Trust, what is it? It's really a security practice. It's been around, for nearly a decade, and it's very, very attractive to corporations moving forward, especially with the work interruptions and social distancing requirements This is really becoming a much more attractive option to those businesses that can afford to work in a distanced environment. Google, for instance, has been using a zero trust model for quite some time, and they've published quite a few articles about how they did their changeover to a zero trust model. But really what it comes down to is we had that castle, and anything within that castle had privileges and rights, and it pretty much went unchecked to a certain degree. But zero trust is more about vetting everything regardless of where it is in relation to the firewall. So we're looking at, okay, you've made it past the firewall, that's cool, but now we need to vet your device, we need to verify the credentials that are being used on that device, and really it enables us to kind of spread the workforce around without relying on one central firewall. And so what zero trust is put it in another term, is deny by default. So what we're going to say is, unless you're on this specific pre-approved list of users or devices, you're not going to be able to interact with much of the network. So kind of to expand upon that a little bit more, it really zero trust aims to enable only the right users under the right conditions to have the right access to the right data. It's kind of a mouthful, but basically it means you get to access what you need to do your job, and without a whole lot of extraneous stuff. It makes onboarding and offboarding a lot easier. And while it may seem like you're putting everything on a lockdown or you're being super restrictive, a successful implementation of zero trust can absolutely help bring context and insight into a rapidly evolving attack surface and improve the experience of your users. I'll get to attack surface on the next slide, but really what zero trust will allow you to do is, regardless of if you're in an on-premise network or if you're traveling abroad, the idea is to enable you, because we've got your device tied to a registered list and we've got your user registered to a specific list of resources, we can give you access to everything that you need regardless of what network you're on. And that enables a lot greater availability for a distributed workforce. So now we're talking about moving outside of the main firewall. We're outside of the organization now, we're moving about, we're doing what we need to do, but from many disparate areas. I mentioned the broader attack surface on the last slide, and the attack surface is really just a term to refer to different points where an unauthorized user can enter or extract data or modify data. As we move services and data stores to the cloud, Microsoft Office 365 is a pretty good example of this, especially for the Kansas Board of Regents schools. Most of us operate in the Microsoft environment, which is why I use that as a reference. But as we move services and data to the cloud, we're definitely introducing extra points of entry, extraction, and modification to the data flow. Now, there are many ways to secure this, and Microsoft's got a wonderful suite of tools to help us do that. The attack surface can also increase as company devices leave the central firewall. So we think about remote work, traveling, all these different scenarios where you aren't jacked directly into the corporate network. And as data moves outside the firewall, organizations can employ a lot of the zero trust model. You don't have to use all of them, but you can copy what works and what doesn't for your organization and allow that to be much more mobile and reactive and responsive while retaining a lot of the best practices for security. And that leads directly to greater service availability. So what are some of the considerations for moving to zero trust? Well, just like any good change in architecture, we've got to plan this out. So we've got to think about our vision and strategy before we begin. So that really means, what do we want to be leveraged outside of the core network? What resources are we going to need? And what are our customers going to have the most benefit from accessing through either web console or some other measure? So that leads us to defining the context. Along with identifying what resources our customers will need, we have to classify those resources. So we have to look at certain things and say, okay, so for remote desktop, for instance, let's look at what the risk is associated by opening the remote desktop capability to our users. There are certainly plenty of tools that can exploit just about any network architecture. But Zero Trust best practice, along with security best practice, looks at how we can enable something like a remote desktop while still maintaining a secure environment. So we look at system hardening, operating system hardening, and certain tasks that we can undertake along with awareness to help secure the network. And so Zero Trust also relies on training of the user base. So now we've kind of got some context. We have an idea of what data is going to be moving back and forth because we've looked at our users, what department are they in, generally, who are they sharing data with, who do they need to share data with within the organization. And we're also looking at hardware that will frequently move within and without of the network. So then we can generate and review our data and hardware classification policy. So we can, through Active Directory, we can assign specific access policies to devices or even users, depending upon the type of data that they're using. So if we, for instance, have a very sensitive laptop with PII or personal health information on it, we can restrict that device from accessing an unsecured Wi-Fi, for instance. And that would be going along with some of the best practices, Zero Trust. And just like I said, this will help control access to a lot of the sensitive resources that you deal with within your organization. Another consideration for moving to Zero Trust is we need to make sure that we know what's going on. So we have to be able to verify and enforce that the policies that we've developed and pushed out through the deployment of our Zero Trust model, we got to make sure that those things are working. One of the ways that we can do that is through the application of group policy in Windows. We can use this to set a device firewall rule. We can do this to assign certain patch management scheduling. There are a lot of different things that we can use group policy for that will enable our devices and our endpoints to be secure, no matter where they are, if they're on network or off network. That's kind of one of the really nice things about a distributed management program such as group policies. Once that device checks in with the server, it can get an updated group policy and it can start taking action on that policy. So kind of the tagline for this is, just take them out with you, even when you leave the castle. Or take the firewall with you, whichever helps recall that. So another consideration for moving is how do we resolve and remediate security incidents? They're going to happen. How do we go about identifying them and securing that device or that resource or that data? There are many different ways to accomplish that. Certainly one of the best practices is having an endpoint detection response software, something like Windows Defender, Semantic Anti-Malware, or something along those lines. And then if you can tie all of those endpoint detection and response instances into a central management console, you're now able to get data from all across your organization. And you can really kind of see what devices are more sensitive than others. And you can readjust and fine tune your policy depending upon what devices you're seeing as being the most targeted. And you can be pretty reactive. The screenshot I've got here is from Microsoft Azure Sentinel security incident and event management software. And we can see all the different endpoints on there. And then through the use of some color coding, we can get an idea of some of the more sensitive areas as well as malicious activity. Now, I don't have extensive experience with Sentinel, but it's certainly something that I'm looking into as a possibility for use within our organization. And so being able to, it was touched on earlier, I think in the last session about logging, having the ability to look at those logs is vital, and having the space to store those logs is also vital. So one of the challenges for moving to a Zero Trust architecture is identifying a good Elasticsearch or repository for your logs to go to. I know in my own home use case, I've got a router with rules and certain security measures on it, and I had to find a good storage place for that. But having that ability has allowed me to identify certain threats within my own home network. So These principles aren't just for the corporate world, but you can also apply them all across your device landscape. So kind of the fourth bullet for considerations before moving to a zero trust is how are you going to be able to analyze and improve your processes? Information security and IT is all about continual improvement. There's no such thing as a static environment. At least there really shouldn't be. We should always be looking at ways to improve or respond better. There's always something better that we can do, whether it's just refining a process, cutting out a step, or finding a new way to do something. The idea is to continually be adjusting and reevaluating policies and practices to make your organization faster and to provide better decision-making tools to the leadership. And it also helps you tighten device security. One of the pieces of this that really kind of helps keep you abreast of the current situation is having a clear inventory of all of your technology solutions. It can help you keep better tabs on how your updates are progressing, get a quick inventory of non-compliant devices. And it also allows you, depending upon how you choose to set up this inventory, it could allow you to go out and provide touch labor in a much more efficient manner. If you've got good metadata on your device location, you can go out and kind of remediate that in the field if you have to. For instance, if a device was taken over by ransomware, we want to take that off network as quickly as possible to prevent proliferation. And if we have a good idea of the inventory, we can respond much quicker. So zero trust in action. We've talked about considerations to make before moving to this model. So now what does this look like in action? Well, specifically with the user base, we all work in higher ed, and we all have a diverse array of users, whether it's facilities and maintenance or student healthcare, residential life, the business department, art department. They all have a different set of use cases and resources tied to them. So with the use of Azure Active Directory, we can really kind of build out some roles for these different use cases. And we can assign specific access policies to these roles. So if you're a nurse, for instance, you need to have access to personal health information as a part of your job. So we would assign the role to the nursing department, and we would ensure that all the nurses fell under this role, and they would have access to the endpoints and the data stores that they needed to access all the pertinent patient information and whatnot. And along with Azure Active Directory, which is the cloud-based version, so that would control perhaps some single sign-on, as well as any Azure tied-in application. But to move to the on-premise solution, we've got just standard Microsoft Active Directory. And for that, we can control resources on-prem, such as servers, computers, and any of the local file stores. So there are two solutions, and the main denominator between the two is the Azure piece. So Azure, think of the cloud, sky blue. So this is where I get to okay, give me an example of this in real life. The zero trust principles are all around us. And I would say that one of the best instances is just think about your vehicle. So you go to a central license issuing facility, they vet that device or your car, they make sure that it's compliant with certain baseline standards, and then they issue a license plate. That license plate allows you to travel about the roads uninhibited. Sure, you could drive it without a license plate. I mean, you can drive a computer without registering it with a certificate of authority as well, but you run the risk of, well, in this case, you'd be physically pulled over if you drove without a license plate. On the digital side, you just wouldn't get where you were intending to go. But then along with that central registration authority, we've got regulation and policy in place that require certain safety measures. So just like we have digital safety measures, like firewall rules and whatnot, the physical regulation and policy requires you to have a bumper, for instance, or seat belts, past certain minimum crash test standards. And Just like your insurance company requires you to lock your car doors to deter theft, a password is much the same for your digital transportation device. It just prevents and puts up an extra layer of protection for your device and your account. And in much the same way, multi-factor authentication is an excellent piece to help safeguard the user. Your car has onboard sensors, give you an indicator warning of unusual behavior, just like an anti-malware program or a cloud-based endpoint detection response program would. They give you indicators. They aren't always compromises. Sometimes it's benign, but you'll get a notification one way or the other. Just like you might get a low wiper fluid indicator on your dash. Well, it's not an emergency, but it's certainly something to look at that could prevent a problem later on. And then we don't generally drive around with an expectation that we're going to get into a collision, but that's where best practice comes in, so that we have these preventive measures to protect ourselves and the important people or data in our lives. So in closing, we went over the core concepts of zero trust, and I'll cover those again real quick because I might have buried them a little bit. But one, we want to move away from a reactive posture. So we want to look, instead of using a blocked list, something that we identify after the fact, we want to move to a proactive approved list. So this would be, we register each device and tie that to a user, and then together you've got a very robust security measure. So if we say we're only going to allow these approved systems on network or to these specific resources, we now get the opportunity to be less reactive and more proactive, which means we'll get fewer alerts, we'll be distracted by those low-level alerts less, and we'll be more focused on tackling the big tasks. Another thing is to use access control lists in combination with your authentication solution, so we can manage devices throughout their entire life cycle. So when you onboard a device, you can get all the metadata about that device, put it into a database, and then that can tie back into your access control measure, and you could tie a specific identifier for that device to a specific access for resources or for servers, what have you. And then employing role-based access policies for the users is absolutely a best practice, and Active Directory allows us to do that very simply. And really, I think the only real pain point that I've seen for developing these roles is just identifying what resources each role would need. That's certainly something that's taking some time on our end to identify, who needs specific access to what. There are a lot of very unique use cases, but once we get those roles stood up, we have a much more resilient process, and it's a lot easier to onboard and offboard. And the third point, make sure that you've got an installed endpoint protection measure and a device firewall. So many times we rely on just the core firewall and then an anti-malware or antivirus program on the user's box. Well, we want to install a firewall on every device that we can, and that allows them to move within and without the network securely. So we don't have to worry about, oh, well, I'm connecting from a home Wi-Fi. I'm using a secure connection, but I still have the potential of having a malicious connection. Well, by having a device level firewall, we eliminate a lot of those malicious attempts. And the fourth thing, continually look at your processes, your data, and your user privileges. These are something that's very easy to get lost on, especially if you have kind of very unique user cases. I know just from experience, sometimes student employees fall into this nebulous realm where they get full-time employee privileges, and then auditing and managing that offboarding process to ensure that those privileges are removed when the student employee leaves that role is a very important piece of our process that we're still fine-tuning. And just as a bonus measure, if you have the capability to ensure the highest level of device security, deploy a remediation server, and that will deliver software upgrades and patches to non-compliant devices. What a remediation server is basically just like think of a truck stop on the side of the road or a way station. When a device checks into the network, there will be an access control measure that would look at some specific policy base or specific software baselines. If that particular device doesn't have what it's needed, that access control measure will point the machine towards this remediation server, at which point it will be delivered the most up-to-date software upgrades and patches. So that kind of encapsulates Zero Trust and what it looks like, at least from my seat at Emporia State University. If there are any questions, I'd like to open it up at this time.
Okay, John, there are a few questions. The first question is from Fred Darko at Kansas State University. And he says, I assume that Zero Trust can use Active Directory to put people in silos. What are other recommendations or tools that could also be used?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So aside from Active Directory, it really depends upon what operating system you're using. Open LDAP is one, and I know Apache Directory works with Kerberos and LDAP. You also have UCS, which is Debian Linux controls for servers, clients, desktops, users, and other services like that. There's also OpenSSO, which is an open source and cross-platform access control system. And that also allows federation. So those are a couple of kind of the key ones.
Okay, Gary Dotson from Emporia State University is asking, what are some of the ways ESU has made progress towards more of a Zero Trust model?
Certainly, thanks, Gary. So part of what we're doing is we're going through and we're auditing Active Directory. We're looking at analyzing our own processes and identifying what we can pull out. And we're also continually reevaluating our on and off board process to identify where we can streamline that. And I think that probably answers Gary's question.
Okay, and then Daniel Tao from Wichita State is asking, do you have any suggestions for getting users, particularly users used to more freedom, to buy into Zero Trust?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. And so I think we're kind of experiencing some of that through the deployment of multi-factor authentication. So it really depends upon how you message that process change out. The way I like to look at it is that we're enabling you to have better access to your resources much faster through a distributed environment. If we have your device registered and we've got that thing patched, we've got all the latest updates on it, it will run more efficiently. So your device will be better managed and you'll have a better experience. You'll have fewer web browser problems. I know that a lot of times when a web browser gets out of date, things break. So that's certainly a way that we can give the positive message for moving to something like this, is that this will enable us to have a much more robust and much faster computing experience.
All right, it looks like that's it for the questions. Thank you, John, and thank you for everyone who attended. That wraps up this session. I hope you've all signed up for one of the Birds of a Feather sessions coming up next. It's been great having you all at this year's conference, and I hope to see you all in person next year.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, everyone.